think this is why people like Trump have been elected, because it went too far. For the vast majority of people, it's like it's too much change too fast. And so what do? It's like, no, reject.
So welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Eyeshot 50 millimeters, our interview series available on YouTube. And today we're sitting down with Ed Kashi, a great photographer, photojournalist, educator, filmmaker. I think the list could go on and on. And it's such a pleasure, Ed, to have you here. You've been photographing and discovering and showing the world incredible places, complex issues, but also lighthearted way of living. So thank you for being with us, Ed, and welcome to Eyeshot for
Thank you
50
for having me.
millimeters. Thank you, Ed, for being with us today. And I just wanted to give a little message to our viewers to keep commenting, keep liking, keep subscribing, because what's just one small click to you means the world for us. And keep supporting independent street photography, independent, made in Italy arts and craftsmanship, and support us because the fun is just beginning. Yeah, that's true. That's very, very true. So, Ed, we want to immediately start off with one of the most toughest questions that we always ask to our guests. So, who is Ed Kashi according to Ed Kashi?
Wow. Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Um, who am I to me? That's a very deep question. I think I see myself as a really as a photographer and a storyteller, and sometimes that's a really beautiful fit, and sometimes it also can become very challenging, especially in the world we're living in today, and a lot of the sort of headwinds we face as image makers, as storytellers, as photojournalists. But since I was, I think, 18 years old, and I fell in love with photography, which was quite a long time ago. That grip, and I've seen this with folks who are not professionals but fall in love with photography. There's something about this craft, this medium, that once it gets its grip on you, you can't let go.
We've also learned, we've done our homeworks, and I know that you had a little passion for literature throughout your life. And you started actually, you wanted to be a writer, if I'm not mistaken, at the beginning of your career. What made you switch, if we can say switch, interest during your life path? Or if it's something that's still part of you, because I know a little bit is still there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, writing is so important, and I fell in love with literature, I think, when I was 15 or 16 years old. And then, frankly, it was a poetry professor in my freshman year at university that absolved me of any notion that I might be a good writer. He
Oh,
he was
wow.
he was quite brutal, and I was probably writing these poems that I thought were so deep and so beautiful, and he just destroyed me. And literally as an 18-year-old kid, I'm like, damn, what am I gonna do? I don't come from a rich family. I don't have like that to fall back on. And yeah, and so I sort of shifted to photography, having never picked up a camera before. It was just something that, yeah, as like a young person, I looked at and imagined, the qualities of life and the things that I imagined I'd want to accomplish as a writer. I could do that through photography.
Interesting. And do you remember the first moment or the first, I guess, the first memory you have of you encountering photography and when you thought, okay, this is my path? What made it for you?
Yeah, well, okay. Well, this is a long time ago, but this was when, if you wanted to learn photography, you took, basic black and white darkroom classes. Literally like rolling film in a reel in the dark, and that very basic, what I like to call sort of the alchemy part of analog photography. Like it's literally alchemy, and I was in the dark and in the dark, in one of those closets where you load film, and I had just learned about Imogene Cunningham, who this is 1976, so she was in her 90s. She was still making pictures, and I was like, wow. So like if I was lucky enough to live that long, I could continue to do this. And it was just like, my brain just opened up and it was like this is what I want to do with my life. And also because there's something about and I still feel this way, there's something about photography that it's like it opens your horizons, it broadens the possibilities of life because the camera is a kind of diplomatic passport into worlds you would otherwise not ever experience, relationships, interactions you might never have. And I was a pretty shy, insecure kid, and so the camera really became a vehicle for me to break out of that shell and gain the confidence to approach a stranger and ask them who they were and be able to photograph them.
Absolutely. One thing, staying on the topic of vision and photography, one thing we always debate about with all our photographers and guests is that you are what you have experienced in your life. We're influenced by experiences, by the people we encounter, where the place we live. And do you think your background, your way of seeing, encountering, talking, meeting people, had in some way helped you or influenced your photographic vision? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah. Well, I've really come to believe this about myself as well as the majority of people I meet who have become photographers. And that is that I always felt somewhat of a misfit. I'm a first generation American. I never felt like I fit in or I was like a cool kid, like I always felt awkward. And so um I've come to realize that a lot of photographers are, immigrants, outsiders, misfits, so we're very comfortable being on the outside looking in, and so that's how I see myself. And even today, I still, even for all the experience and accomplishments and confidence that I've built up and all that, I still can feel that way, and especially because of the work I've done so much work outside of my country where I truly am an outsider, and I think the way that it's influenced my approach, I guess it's sort of twofold. One is that this way of seeing what I call the abandoned moment, where it's sort of really sort of dancing through life and just shooting from the hip, where I'm trying to be invisible and make really not easy, it's true, because you've never met me, but I'm 6'1", so I'm not a little person, and then but also I have come to I real recognize that I'm an extremely empathetic person. I'm a very gentle person. I might be big, and that might not be the impression I give off at first sight, but I really am a bit of a pussycat, and so I think people pick up on that. But they pick up on that, and I think that's why I've been able to get what I call like candid intimacy. These moments that are very intimate, very close to people, especially in moments in their lives where they're compromised or vulnerable or going through a difficult moment. And I really believe that some of the inherent qualities that I have served me really well in the kind of work I've ended up doing.
Absolutely. I can definitely see that. And I've been meeting you, talking to you since a couple of months, and I already can feel all these things that you said. But how did it start your photojournalism path? More specifically, how did everything begin?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, once I fell in love with photography and I decided that this was going to be my my life, I started to learn about photographers like Marielle and Mark, and which were contemporary to me. Of course, Bresson and Eugene Smith and so many of the greats that came before me influenced me. But I I realized that what I was attracted to was this idea of social documentary work. Honestly, I think if I didn't become a photographer, I would have been a social worker or a therapist or an anthropologist. That for me, it was about getting close to people, absorbing and listening to their problems, if you like, and trying to figure out how to be helpful. And so from early on, I was always attracted to issues that you would say, let's say, are social documentary issues. And even before I had my big breakthroughs in my career, I was always trying to work on those kinds of projects and those kinds of issues. But the real breakthrough for me was when I started to go to Northern Ireland in 1988, and I spent 3 years going back and forth developing a big personal project there. And that was really where I feel like I broke through aesthetically, on every level. And the other thing that I learned, I was in my late 20s at that point. One of the things that I learned by my mid 20s was that to be a better photographer, I needed to become a better human being. I didn't need to learn how to work with f-stops better or light. I really needed to learn how to be a more mature, empathetic person because, I remember that when I was in my 20s, it was so much about serving my needs and all of that stuff. And there's nothing wrong
Which
with
is
that.
fair.
That's human
Yeah,
nature. But
absolutely.
that's one of the challenges of doing this kind of work is you really need to be able to get outside of yourself, you know?
Exactly. And try to find that distance as well, because like helping people seeing certain conflicts, seeing the lives of others, it's not always something that's easy to observe as a human being, to load yourself also of these problems that are out there. So that's also something very much for being in the mid 20s, like people in the mid 20s think about other stuff, but
Right. I was
you know
thinking about, going out on dates and what movies I was gonna, well, what movies we were gonna watch, which restaurants we are gonna eat out at. No, very, very shallow. No, no.
I want to ask you a little bit more about your influences. You mentioned Mary Ellen Mark as one of your main influences. Could you tell me some other names that are both contemporary and also part of the icons that went before you, and why this particular figures?
Well, it's funny. I don't love to talk about this only because I'm at a point now where, in a way, I influence myself and everybody influences me. Honestly, but I would say that my early sort of photographic influences were, Cartier-Bresson and Eugene Smith and, Don McCullen, some of the Cortege and some of the great black and white photographers. Interestingly, they were not National Geographic photographers, which is what I went on to become
So
on some level.
yeah,
There was really that Life magazine, black and white work, getting into people's lives, sort of showing me the world in a way that I had never seen. And anyway, so but then once I started to work in the 1980s and the 90s, they were really more contemporaries. Salgado, Eugene Richards, Gilles Perez, and Jim Noctway. I would say like those were the four photographers that were sort of 10 to 15 years older than me that were concurrently working, where I looked at their work and the issues they were dealing with, the way they saw the world, that really it really resonated with me. There was a seriousness and also sort of a visual brilliance to the way they captured the world. But like I say, now, I mean, I could be teaching a workshop with someone who might be a retired dentist, and it's like, wow, that was a really great picture. But a lot of it is really looking at my own work and examining kind of where I'm at and what I'm trying to achieve at this point.
A couple questions before we wrap up this section. Just a little bit of an icebreaker. What was your first camera?
Oh, yeah, a Ryko. It was a rental camera because I didn't have enough money to buy a camera. So
That's valid. That's what the early to mid 20s are like, honestly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same.
exactly. And another thing I wanted to ask you, talking about first times, do you remember one of the first photographs you took that made you think maybe I'm on the right track?
That's a great question. You know, I tell you, it was when I was a student, and I was studying in London, and I was on a field trip to Bath, England, and I made a picture of a Jamaican preacher that just I encountered on the street. I actually didn't really know what I was doing. I was playing with Flash, which then seemed like a mind blowing thing to play with, Flash on camera in daylight, and I made a picture that ended up being just like I I didn't realize you could achieve that level of quality and texture and depth. And also I captured this moment that had a lot of energy. And I remember going back to the dark room and processing the film, and that moment where you see the image come up. I know it seems like a cliche, but it's so true. You see it
Mm.
coming up in the tray and you're just like, I don't know. I can't describe a experience of being more high and just like
Yeah,
jacked up,
legit.
because
Yeah.
it's the alchemy, it's the magic, water and solutions and materials, and voila, you have this image. It's amazing. It's amazing. So that was to me the first moment, where I really kind of thought like, wow, okay, there might be something here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. It's a very, you know, it's heartwarming to know that everyone starts with a moment of wonder. That's I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah,
it. That's how
yeah,
one begins. And on to slightly gloomier topic. I read one editorial piece that you wrote for Time where you described your work as a vanishing act, as a disappearing act. The fact that you become the extension of your machine rather than the opposite. And I was wondering, how do you navigate the impact that being a photojournalist, especially covering the themes and stories that you cover, how do you navigate the impact that all this has on your sense of self?
yeah, yeah. Well, it's a question that I myself and I think my colleagues get asked a lot who do this kind of work. And I mean, for me, it's interesting. This goes back to sort of, I guess, empathy in a way, because what I've seen over the years, over the decades, is it's my empathy battery fluctuates. And so I guess there's two parts to answers to the question. One is um, how do I deal with it, I guess. But well, anyway, so there's one moment that I think about a lot that your question conjures up for me, and that was in 2008, and I was working on a story about Arab Christians in the Middle East, and I was in Damascus, and we were interviewing Iraqi refugees who had escaped, Iraqi Christians who had escaped the most horrific, like 10 family members killed in front of them kinds of things. Well, 2 months before, I my father-in-law, who we had moved into our home in New Jersey, and we cared for him the last 2 years of his life, he had died, and so I'm in this room, and this Iraqi man is telling me the most horrific stories, and I'm thinking, normally, I would, like, be crying, I would be in tears and emotional. All I was thinking about was, I can't wait to get back to my hotel room. And I realized at that moment that because of the personal experience I had just been through, on top of all of the professional experiences like that moment, that it drained me. Like my empathy battery was drained. And then I thought, oh shit, what is wrong with you, man? Like and it wasn't that I didn't feel something for this guy, but it was more like I realized like I wasn't able to feel or absorb quite as deeply as I normally would. Anyway, I don't know why your question made me think of that moment where I think it's something we all as humans struggle with, not just as a photojournalist. Sometimes we have friends who all they do is complain about their relationship, and there are times where it's like, I can't listen to you anymore.
That's
Go
it.
see a therapist. Anyway, but I
And
would
how do
say in
you
terms of how,
deal with it? You
yeah,
were saying,
yeah,
I really want to
yeah.
know. Yeah.
Well, I think I count myself as really fortunate that I have a life mate, Julie, who has amazingly stuck with me through all this for over 30 years. And then I had two beautiful, thank goodness, healthy kids who, we love each other. Like it's genuine and there's not conflict between us. So I feel that, not that it's always been easy, but I feel that those three people form the kind of support that allows me to not lose it, quite frankly, And then, I've been in and out of therapy at times. I've used substances at times, to be honest. I mean, right now I'm clean of all that, but it's a mixture of things. Friends, of course, friends, but even like conversations like this, honestly, just where I think where where you get to connect with people and feel like you're heard and so it's a real mixture of things. And I always wonder, like, folks who have to do this work and have not had and do not have a family, and nothing against that. I just wonder, what are they made of that they can hold it together, because it's such a lonely profession. It's such a
Exactly.
lonely form of work, and which is ironic, right? Because on the one hand, I'm going out in the world and I'm having these incredibly rich experiences, but it's interesting. If I may blather on here, it makes me think of a quote by Richard Avedon, who's a completely different type of photographer. But
Yeah.
I remember that quote where he would be like, I can have the most intimate photo session with a subject where I feel like I've, captured their soul. And an hour later, I could pass them on the streets of Manhattan and I would not recognize them. And I always thought that was a bit chilling on the one hand, but also kind of instructive, that this is a weird thing we do as photographers. It's like I can seduce you, and I mean that in a nice sense. I can seduce you to, like, pose for me and let me photograph you, and it feels like this intense deep moment, and then an hour later or a day later, it's like we moved on. Yeah, and it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. Yeah, so I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. And thank you for being vulnerable with us. It really, really means the world. And we are very glad that we got to hear your thoughts on the matter, because it's a very tough subject. And similarly, I wanted to ask you, you have talked about your work as advocacy journalism, among other definitions. So, how does one balance social engagement with objectivity in narration, in when in storytelling?
Yeah, yeah. So this whole idea of objectivity is something, of course, that emanates from the world of journalism, and rightly so, because especially in this moment where there's so many forces and characters trying to demean journalism and devalue it, and unfortunately doing a really good job of it, much to our detriment and our society detriment. That's another subject. But anyway,
We'll get into
um,
that.
yeah,
Absolutely.
okay, gladly, gladly. So my view of objectivity is, so if I'm on assignment, if I'm being commissioned by whatever, the New York Times or National Geographic, or a journalistic outlet, then I will approach, even if I'm going into a place or a subject where I have a bias against them, right? I will try to shed myself of that, because what I also know is that, I don't know, I could give you some specific examples if you like. If, So in 2013, I was working with the great Ashley Gilbertson for the New Yorker on a piece about drought in Oklahoma. Okay, the big, huge drought that was taking place. So I've got in with this like rancher. I mean, he is out of like Hollywood, central casting, big belly, cowboy hat, just really. And the first day I show up and they're branding their cattle, and he looks at me, and he goes, "So you're some liberal New Yorker, huh?" And I'm thinking, "Oh, great! This is a great way to start. Like, hello, how are you? So what am I gonna go like fuck you? It's like. So I was like, ah, ha, ha, ha. And then I said, in New York, when someone from Oklahoma comes, we love you. Okay, so that was that. And then days go on, we're working together. But I'm thinking like, so clearly this guy has shown me his bias, right? And what I'm trying to do is actually tell an empathetic story about how this man's livelihood is threatened by this environmental by climate change, right? By the fifth or sixth day, we're in his vehicle. By the way, a lot of modern ranchers they corral their cows on in SUVs, not horses. Anyway, and we're in the SUV. It's air conditioning, right? It's absolutely like cold, hot outside. Anyway, we start talking about our teenage daughters. We both start to cry, and it was this amazing moment where all that crap of politics and blue and red and left and right just dissolved, and we were just two fathers commiserating about our fears for our daughters. And I thought, wow, this is such a beautiful moment. And so anyway, sorry, I'm really digressing here, but so the point is that when I'm on assignment and I'm representing a publication or an organization, I can remain objective, whatever that means, which is that even if I have a bias against you or what your political stance or moral whatever, I will try to put that aside and try to approach you with an open heart and an open mind, because ultimately we are all human beings and there's always some touch point hopefully we can find to make a connection, like I did with that rancher. But when I'm in my own personal projects, objectivity to me isn't the key element. It's really about um, trying to tell stories where I retain the dignity of my subjects and there's integrity to my work. Like I've never been good at sliming people. I'm just not good at that. There are some photographers that are amazing at doing that, in the same way that there are amazing photographers who are amazing at capturing humor. Elliot Irwood, of course, would be the great example. But anyway, um, so I try to really maintain an even sort of approach to things. I mean, if I may continue, right now the project that I'm working on with my wife, with Julie, who's a writer, called American Sketches, where we're going to places like Texas and Mississippi and Florida, which would be considered, hostile territory or red states. And I'm so sorry I say that all in quotes because I also don't believe in that stuff because it's artificially dividing us. But anyway, and we're spending time with folks that we might not ordinarily hang out with, and it's amazing. And we're finding so many touch points and so many points of commonality, and so that's what I'm sort of searching for. Not so much like how are we different and what divides us. Now, going to the advocacy part, if I may, or should I be quiet now?
Absolutely.
No,
Please go on. We're having a ball here. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, all right.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I'm on my second cup of coffee now. Um,
Totally fair.
yeah, no, I think the advocacy work. This is something that I would say at least 10 years ago I started to feel a kind of frustration with journalism, and in that it's not enough to shine a light on a problem. And I think I really sort of picked this up from my kids, who at that point were teenagers. I would come back from Iraq or Afghanistan. They couldn't give a shit where I just was. And they didn't want to hear about like the problems there. And then when we'd be listening to, NPR or complaining about something we read in the New York Times, I could just see how they were turning off because all they heard was negativity, negativity, hopelessness, hopelessness. And then I realized like this is not cool because then I'm not actually accomplishing what I ideally would like to accomplish, which is to shine a light on a problem, but 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 sort of generate or inspire not just hope but action, to have impact. And so, and just to be clear, I have nothing against photographers and journalists who are witnessing and bearing witness and shining a light on problems. Thank goodness they continue to do that work. Thank goodness. But I see my role more as a kind of advocacy journalist. I think a New York Times journalist coined the phrase solutions journalism years ago. And I feel that that is a more comfortable fit for me now, where again, so for example, for the last decade, I've worked on the issue of chronic kidney disease around the world, and that work actually changed like labor laws in Nicaragua and El Salvador. It's actually been a part of change in a positive way for workers. Or more recently in Nepal and Qatar, looking at the impact of heat on manual laborers, and that's the current sort of theme that I'm trying to explore. So it's interesting, I sort of joke that, 20 years ago I decided, or 30 years ago, I was going to bridge the chasm between Islam and the West. I didn't do a very good job, did I? But that's but that's the hubris of youth, right? Like,
Yes,
oh, I'm going to
exactly.
take this massive issue and somehow,
Fix it.
yeah. So now I look at it much more humbly.
Mm.
Where is there an issue that I care about, I have some expertise and knowledge in, and I can use my camera or my words or video or motion or sound, whatever it may be, or a combination of all those things to, social media to have an impact and make a difference. And that's how I see advocacy work being. So this idea of objective, subjective, it's like there's just something else I've learned. It's like it is not cool that like migrant laborers in Italy are toiling in 100-degree, 80% humidity weather to pick your tomatoes. And then
Absolutely.
they're treated like shit,
Yeah.
and I don't know that from experience. I know that from photographers I've mentored who have shown me that through their work.
These photos.
So,
Wow.
it's that idea, that's there is no th- it's not okay. There's no two sides to it. It is not
No.
okay. So
Yeah.
that's the idea with advocacy work. I hope that explained it, or you know.
You were crystal clear, and thank you for sharing. So once we got objectivity not out of the picture, but not as the main focus, what's the driving force that leads your editing and selection when you're selecting photos for a story?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. It's on the one hand, in a perfect world or a perfect set of pictures, which there's no such thing, but that I I guess it's two things. I want to be able to tell the story. I want to create a visual narrative that makes sense. Of course, always with the support of a certain amount of words, because again, photojournalism, the words and pictures matter, and
Exactly.
it's actually
Together.
quite a beautiful symbiosis when you get it right. And in my case, sometimes also video to support that. But anyway,
Yeah.
so to tell the story, but also to achieve a certain level of like aesthetic or artistic quality. Because what I've learned through the decades is that, and this is, I think, one of the very hard, one of the challenges of doing photojournalism is that we don't control the situation. We don't control the light. We don't control the background. We often, people don't even want us there. Like there's so many barriers to getting to that moment where we make a powerful image, but also beautiful might be the wrong word, but let's say an aesthetically powerful image. Where that's always the goal, the dream, right? Is to make, I guess, a piece of art that also has impact. But for me, the impact comes first.
There's a saying, there's an expression that is basically pain porn or misery porn. and covering tough issues, real issues in the world, can thread this line sometimes. How does photojournalism go about it? How can you avoid a paternalistic eye when you're showing real suffering of real people? Because that's what it is.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and it's a really important one. And in a way, it's kind of connected to the last answer I gave, um, which is why, for me, it's the information and impact that come first, not the aesthetics. For better or worse, that's just how I see things. I feel like there's huge challenges we face now, partly because of the sheer volume of media and imagery. Obviously, you know this, but it's a fact, and it's real that there's just too much information, too much imagery, and um, and so how does any one image or any set of images have impact? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Um, um, and in terms of like aestheticizing misery, I think that's a very real issue. It's interesting. I look at some of the ways that certain photographers and certain publications tone their work, and the New York Times in particular. I think of, like, there's a sort of very dark, actually I think it's a Rome based lab that does a lot of the toning, but where it's very dark and it's very heavy, and it's not about like the quality of the imagery is still beautiful or powerful. It's just that I wonder, as a consumer, if everything is sort of very dark and heavy, what are we how does it impact the way we're portraying the world to our viewers? And
Exactly.
that's a question that I don't wrestle with it personally, because I don't approach my work that way. But as a
Exactly.
consumer, and also
Yeah.
someone who really cares about the efficacy of media and
Mm.
our ability to continue to inform and have impact and touch people's hearts, and especially like younger generations, you know inspire them to be
Absolutely.
engaged and get involved. Again, I think we need to be careful that if we go too far down the rabbit hole of art and aesthetics, that we run the risk of distancing our work from the hearts and minds of our viewers. Now, if your goal is to be collected in museums and have your work sold in galleries, that's different. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, but that's not how I see the role of photojournalism and at least reality-based documentary work.
Absolutely. I feel like that's kind of what we were trying to aim with it. I think you know that about we've done a book, Bearing Witness, which is all about Gaza and Palestinians, and we have these 6 photographers there, and they all have such a different eye in their photograph. And what we really wanted to avoid was exactly this, like telling us stories without being taken advantage, if I can say that, of the pain and the distractions and these 80 years of brutality that Palestinians are still suffering again and again and again. And we wanted to give it a more uh, real, which destruction is real, of course, bombing is totally real, but a different side of it, for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a
And
there's a focus on life in the book.
Exactly.
So as little death as possible. Basically,
more-
that was the aim, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
that's a really important that's an important point, and I feel often it's missed in war reporting, or especially war photography, that there is life outside of. I think maybe some of the reporting from the Ukraine has shown that, like, there'll be a story about the Kiev Symphony or something. I don't know, like that you realize that there's still cafe life, and people are still getting up and going to school, and you know even I mean, but God is like an is so out of bounds.
Yeah.
There's another level of I don't know. I mean, there are really no words. There are no words for this insanity. And I've probably been to Israel, Palestine about 19 times in my career. I started going there in 1991 or two, and there was a point for me where I talk about empathy again, like where I was sort of like, you know what? It seems like you guys just want to fight. Like, because surely this does not make sense to continue all this, you know. But anyway, that's my own personal opinion that it's like on some level, but now it's just gone. It's over the top. This
It's
is just
completely out of control.
It's just over the
Yes,
top, and I don't know. I don't know if we can talk about this. I don't know how Israel rehabilitates itself after this.
exactly.
I don't understand. I don't understand how Gaza. I don't. It's just so hard to understand what can happen. I don't know. I mean, I guess Dresden was destroyed. You know, obviously we dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they
Yeah.
somehow came back. But anyway, sorry.
But there are
It's a
different
very dark.
times, right? I mean, like right now, it's so impossible to not be complicit of anything. Like you are complicit even if you're standing on your sofa and not doing anything in a sort of way. I'm externalizing it a little bit, but we're all complicit in this, from normal people to politicians to everyone. So I don't know
Yeah.
how all of us will ever
Recover.
recover from this. But
Well, and you know, and something else has happened. It seems to me. I don't remember. Yeah, not in my lifetime. This also happening simultaneously is the sort of the censorship war. This
Mm,
sort of, you know, whether it's on college campuses or in public debate or, um, you know, forums and conferences where there's actually like censorship, which seems to be just about like pro-Israel, using the anti-Semitism card, which is sort of nullifying public
everything
debate
else.
about
Yeah.
this. And so that's something I can't remember witnessing that in my lifetime, while simultaneously this destruction is going on and this killing
It's
is going
interesting.
on. So and it's yeah, it is really interesting. Well, it's more than interesting. It's actually horrific and tragic. But um, I understand why Trump and his people are doing it. But anyway, it's
Um, Uh, I don't know if we'll ever get an answer for this, but it's definitely a very important questions.
Yeah.
Ed, going to something a little lighthearted, which is not true. So I'm going to be lighthearted for the next question.
anything is lighthearted after that.
I mean, you're right. Totally right. I wanted to ask you, Ed, as I was saying a little bit before when I was introducing you, you've been to over 100 countries. You have 4 decades of experience. You went from the oil crisis in the Niger Delta to kidney disease that we were talking a little bit beforehand, to the greed of capitalism. You've seen it all, basically. And what pushes you to follow or to take on certain projects rather than different ones? Maybe we touched a little bit on it before, but what is that drive? What's your driving force for specific project like this ones?
Yeah. Well, again, it all emanates from, you know, the gut. Well, it's the axis of the gut, the heart, and the mind. That's what I always talk about when I teach or mentor is like when you can align these three elements, then you're on the right path. And so, um, which also means that it's not remained constant in my career. You know, you know, 30 years ago it was about, you know, I want to work in the Middle East, I want to work in the Muslim world, I want to, you know, there's certain issues that I want to deal with. And then, you know, I wanted to look at aging in America completely,
Yeah,
like a complete
big difference.
pivot, you know. But it was because in all cases, or now then kidney disease and now heat stress on workers, you know, but they all emanate from the same place, which is I genuinely care about it, I want to learn more, I feel it's important for other people to know about this. And I can imagine making images and stories that will sort of resonate and reverberate. You know, there are so many important issues that I would never consider touching because I don't know how I would make a picture of it. Or, so it's the other thing, especially when I teach or mentor, is like, it's so important, if you're going to be a visual journalist or a visual storyteller, that you pick subjects that are somewhat visual. you know yeah, like there's amazing investigative stories to be done, but those are written stories. Yeah, there might be a few images that can go along with it, but you can't possibly visualize the guts of those stories. So that's always been important to me, to choose things that I care about. So like in th- my intellect is touched by it, my heart is touched by it. That means I care. And then in my gut, I just feel like not I can't not do this, you know.
And is there any project or stories that you still haven't been able to document that you really wish you've had the chance to document before?
Well, I mean, there's too many. I don't know where to begin.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's too many. That's a hard question to answer. Yeah, I'd have the inventory is very large. That
Yeah, I
um,
bet you.
I,
I bet you.
yeah, and and sometimes it's also, there might be issues that I really care about, but as I sort of just alluded to, I can't. I either it's too dangerous to do, especially at this stage in my life. There's certain things I'm just not going to do anymore because I just know that I can't have impact, and it's too stressful. So it's really about being smart in the choices we make, in the subjects or the issues that we pursue. um yeah, I mean, also, if I may, there's this whole other element that's been introduced in the last, I want to say, 5 to 10 years, which is really related to sort of the rise of identity politics, which in its own weird way has created a form of censorship. Um, where it's sort of like, I deeply care about women's issues. I deeply care about issues in like the African American community. And I'm kind of being told that it's not legitimate for me to do those anymore because I am not I don't those people, and so I find that a bit frustrating. I totally
Yes.
understand why
Where it comes
this
from.
is I
Yeah.
totally get it. I totally get it. But I feel like, and frankly, if I may, I think this is why people like Trump have been elected, because it went too far. It didn't
Absolutely.
go too far to, like, super intelligent, switched on people in urban areas, but which are tiny, tiny part of our populations. But for the
Yeah.
vast majority of people, it's like it's too much change, too fast. And so what do? It's like, no,
The
reject.
easiest
Instead,
things.
so
Exactly.
anyway, so woof, that was a whole nother rabbit hole I started to go down. But
Yeah.
it's also because this is like what Julie and I have witnessed in this work we're doing in America,
Exactly.
because of immigration being allowed to be out of control, and this sort of identity politics or wokeness. I hate that fucking term now. Excuse me. That it turned off even good, reasonable people. It turned them away. And I think this is a huge mistake. I don't know if that's happening in Europe to the same degree. I suspect at least a little bit, but the
Yeah.
immigration issue is a very sensitive topic.
Especially in Italy.
Yeah,
Italy
yeah,
immigration's something we cannot even discuss.
yeah.
Right.
For this
In
kind of
Germany, the Netherlands,
Germany, true.
UK.
Absolutely.
So anyway, we're getting into a little bit of politics here, which I don't have a problem with, but again, as given the work that I do and what I see, I have this like almost a privileged position to see these things and kind of put them together. This is where I wish I was a great writer, but but we'll save that for the great writers to write about, which they do. But that that you can just, it's like it's heartbreaking to see it happening and to realize like we we've been unable to stop this, and now we're stuck in this position of I can't believe in my lifetime that I'm now living in an authoritarian regime, in a period of authoritarianism, because I grew up in the 60s and 70s in New York, where it just felt like the world
So
was just opening
liberating.
up. Oh my God,
Yeah.
yeah, women's rights and civil rights and environmentalism and all
Yes.
these beautiful, beautiful animal rights, all these beautiful, like, the raising of human consciousness, you know. Maybe not quite like the Renaissance in Italy in the 15th century, but
Yeah.
or 16th, but but
That's a good,
like it felt
yeah,
that way.
it's a good
Anyway, and now
comparison.
it's like things
Yeah.
are
It's
closing in.
collapsing. It's
Yeah.
collapsing again.
What is happening with ICE in the US is
Oh
just
my God.
speechless. Like, I'm not really understanding how can you even have the authority of just entering a farmer and just take them out without no right or anything. That's something that truly scared me and really
Yeah.
didn't resonate
Well,
at all.
and this is very much, again, well, talking about media and imagery and visuals. I mean, unfortunately, Trump is brilliant at this stuff. He has figured it out. So, you know,
Knows.
it's like him and his people. It's like, yeah, we don't care that like a percentage of the population will be outraged. What we want to we want to sow fear, and then there's a whole bunch of our population that will think we're being strong.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It makes no sense.
he's playing to the worst of human sensibilities. He's like
Yeah.
he's playing to the
He's
worst of our
tapping in that.
tendencies.
Yeah, I was thinking this is the second time that we have an economic recession so bad that as the economy collapses, authoritarianism rises. There was one instance 1 century ago when this happened, and it didn't go very well. So
No.
I'm not I'm not sure whether I should go on with my life or just be there and check it out, because nobody likes the direction the world is going.
It just seems like so many of the things that are happening here in the States will be the exact opposite of making us great. And I don't, like, I know we're constantly saying, like, when are people going to wake up and realize that what he is doing is dismantling the things that have made us great? And honestly, do you remember, there was a film, I think it was originally in the 1960s or late 50s, The Manchurian Candidate, and then it
Yes, I
was
know that.
remade. I think it was remade in the 80s or 90s with Denzel Washington. But it's
Yes,
this idea. It's this
1994, I think.
right. Whoa, good memory. All right.
And Lou
So
has a passion for cinema. Just that, so be careful with that.
I am the IMDb of Eyeshot.
that's all right. But it was that idea that an American candidate for president is really, not so much a robot but like a puppet of the Soviet Union in that case, right? And it feels like that's what Trump is. He's doing the bidding of Russia, of Putin. It's so bizarre. It's so bizarre, but it will not. He will not prevail. It will not last. There will be tremendous damage and pain and cruelty, and it will go on maybe for a few more years. But I don't believe that he will not prevail, because the
So,
ultimately there's way more Americans that are good and don't believe in this stuff. But unfortunately, we're going to have to be put through a really, really terrible time where a lot of people have already been hurt and will continue to be hurt. And and but I think, again, as sort of storytellers, as visual journalists, this is part of our duty, is to continue, just as I always say, continue the drumbeat of these stories. Because if we stop, then we lose. Then they truly win. You
yeah,
know.
exactly. Exactly. I would like to change topic a little bit because I think we
Please.
could talk about this for
Yeah, honestly.
days. Yeah, honestly.
And we love talking about this.
Yes. We do have a vibe.
as you noticed, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't want to
But-
keep you too busy with us in that sense. And I want to go a little bit more deeper into your photographic language in a way, and I want to talk a little about techniques somehow that you apply. And my first question would be: your photographs are often very much layered and charged with meaning and sensibilities, feelings, emotions. What is for you a layered photograph? What does it need to have to be, in a way, powerful to you,
yeah.
of course?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few different qualities. I can make an image that is photographically simple. There's not a lot, there's not visual complexity, but it's a very powerful moment, or the character, or the combination of the moment, the light, the character, the expression can be very powerful. But in general, what I look for is I to insert myself in visual situations in situations where the visual elements will help me tell the story I'm trying to tell. So that always means looking for, I guess, juxtapositions. Like, someone working in a very hot environment. Where there's one or two other elements that allude to that condition, if you like. And that is really a challenge, because sometimes it means I'm working in situations that are aesthetically crap, that are like the light
Exactly.
sucks, the background isn't good, or like it's less than ideal visual situations. But to me, that is the challenge of doing this work. Is And it's also the challenge of doing one's, I guess, research and understanding your subject, so that you insert yourself in the right place at the right time. And it, I remember that, like, when I'd be working on the big net geo stories, and sometimes you'd spend, I mean, these budgets today couldn't do it, but you might spend 3 or 4 days to make one picture. But you did your research, you traveled whatever time it took to get to that exact place at the right time on the right day, where it was coming together. And so we don't have, well, in my personal work, I have that luxury of time. But in assignment work, it is so rare now that any client, even the geographic at this point, to a large degree, can afford that. So anyway, a bit of a digression there, but
No.
for me, the technique's really about getting into the right situation with the right visual elements, and barring that, or as well as just being in moments of raw emotion, where something powerful is happening, and you just hope you capture it in a compelling and dignified way.
And how do you build that connection with your subject? You've been to places that are not really, it's not really easy to be invisible in a way. So, how do you build trust with those subjects? How do you take care of what they're, in a way, confining in you?
Well,
It's the toughest part, perhaps. I don't know.
yeah. Well, there's something, I don't know, mercurial, or what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, that it's not. There's not necessarily straight line of logic all the time. And,
Yeah.
like, literally, there are times where, like, there's one situation from my work in Nicaragua on the chronic kidney disease project, where within 5 minutes of meeting the subject, I was photographing him lying in bed dying, with his 15-year-old son massaging his feet. Within 5 minutes, you would look at, I don't know what others think, but you would think, wow, did you spend days or weeks getting to know these people? And then there are times where I've spent days or weeks getting to know someone, and I can't make a goddamn picture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's sort of like, it's so mercurial.
Crazy.
It's so,
Yeah.
that's why you have to have such, like, flexible thinking, and you have to have patience. But at the same time, you need to be able to react when the moment strikes. You need to be able to recognize that this is happening, it might not happen again. So it's not so linear all the time. Um, obviously the majority of the time it's more of a, you do your research, you hopefully find the right people, you get them to
Okay.
agree, you get access, you spend time with them, you learn their story, you make a connection so they trust you, right? And they feel
Exactly.
comfortable around you, if that's what's appropriate. Sometimes you don't necessarily want your subjects to be comfortable, depending on the
Yeah.
nature of what you're doing,
Of what
and
you're
then
doing.
and then your physical, I mean, again, the onus, the challenge for photographers is we need to physically be in the time and space where something happens. We can't hear about it, we can't read about it, we have to be there, which is also what makes this work so exciting and powerful and rewarding, because I'm there, I witness it with
Exactly.
my own
Very
eyes, I
immersive.
smell it, I
Yeah.
hear it,
Exactly. And you
it's
were talking,
visceral.
yeah, a little bit about this before. You have become also multimedia kind of
Mm.
photographer, storyteller. It would be, I think, the best word to use. And how do you mix all this uh, different mediums, just like audio, cinema, like video making, to create the story? Why do you think you might need that kind of tools as well to tell your story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the genesis of this, doing like multi-platform storytelling was what I call it, where I'm integrating still photography, video, and of course writing, is was during my project on aging in America, where I was working with Julie, and we had been working. It was about an 8-year long project. About 3 or 4 years into it, I had this crazy idea of, we should start doing interviews with our subjects, because we're sitting with these elderly folks for hours sometimes, and we're making our notes and all that,
Yeah.
analog, old school, because this was while I was still shooting with Leicas and film and all that. Anyway, and then I'm thinking, but we are losing so much of the texture and the voices of the subject. So I started in 2000 to shoot. We started to work in video, just for that simple, which now seems so naive and simplistic. Just for that reason, like, I thought it
Yes.
would be so cool to have my black and white prints in an exhibition, and then a monitor with them talking. Of course, that's ridiculously simple now, but back then it
Now, but
seemed.
the time, yeah.
Right.
Wow.
And that's really where it started. It was the desire to capture the voice of my subjects. And then you scroll forward, and then the internet comes along, and social media and websites and all these digital platforms where we can connect with people globally now. It is more powerful than ever that, I'm not telling you the experience of that Nepalese worker in Qatar. He is telling you. You're hearing it in his voice. And hopefully my images, whether they're motion or still, are the sort of gateway into his story. And I think that, and I don't think, I know, there's something so much more powerful than you know, me telling people your story. Now you can tell your own story.
To the people. Yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully my imagery, you know, complements it, or inspires
Supports it.
people to
Yeah.
listen to you.
Exactly.
So
Wow.
that's really how it's sort of emanated, and um, now, generally, when I would say the majority of the projects that we do, I think of in this hybrid visual approach of, I want to do still pictures because I love still photography, but I also want to work in video and sound, because I know that it gives us the raw materials to put together, this idea of multi-platform storytelling, um, all the way to social media, let alone like short documentaries and so forth. What's interesting, I will say though, is this Project American Sketches that Julie and I are working on. We are going old school.
Oh, I love that.
It's
Oh,
words
like,
and pictures, words and
wow.
pictures.
Wow.
Because having said everything I just said about all this, there's also something so beautiful about just hanging out with people and not sticking mics up their shirt and asking to do formal interviews, and like, there's just something about hanging out with people and just shooting the shit and learning and just being there, and then making images or taking notes. that we're finding, ironically, or maybe not ironically, so refreshing.
I want to go back just a little bit on some terminology that you have used throughout this interview and in other interviews. So you have talked about candid intimacy. You have explained what it means to you, but how do you achieve it? How do you best achieve that sense of candid intimacy when you are with a subject, even in relation to what you just said?
Yeah. Well, so I guess I achieve it by really getting close to people and getting them to trust me, uh, and feel comfortable enough that I can be around them in these moments. And really, that term came to me organically, maybe 15, 20 years ago, because I I would hear so many times from people like, I, I, I can't believe you captured that moment, and it's like you weren't there. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So, this idea of intimacy, but it's candid, that the presence of the photographer is not there. So just that was the genesis of that term for me. And so again, it's just by yeah, just by getting close to people, and like physically close, not just emotionally or psychologically, and achieving a level of comfort that I always like to say that, like, I like to be able to, like, I want to make pictures where I'm close enough to touch people. I know you're not supposed to touch people anymore. No.
I mean,
Sorry. I had
no,
to,
it's okay.
but like
Yeah.
that's really kind
Yeah.
of, which is really interesting, because when I used to work with the Geographic, I always was so bad at doing the landscape sense of place pictures.
Typical geographic,
Absolutely.
Yeah, because for me, the emotion and the feeling was from being
Yeah.
close to you,
to
you
be
know, and anyway, thankfully I've matured and learned how to do those other pictures. But anyway, but it still for me is the most powerful um, feeling, is when I'm someone has allowed me into their space, and I can move somewhat freely and be close to them, and then have them forget I'm there. This work is so weird.
Mm.
No, honestly, when I teach people, I'm like, you understand what we do is really weird, because I'm basically asking you to let me into the bathroom while you bathe your naked mother, but don't talk to me.
Don't look at me. I'm not there.
Right. So
If you don't
I
see
know
me,
I
I'm not
was,
there. I love it.
yeah,
Perfect metaphor.
Yeah, there is a humor to just being there and having life happen before your lens, basically. And I wanted to dive a little bit into the fact that we are currently in an era where we are very aware of, consent, privacy. There has to be a very high level of comfort to let the photographer so close at an arm's distance. The camera, be it a cell phone or an actual camera, especially when a photographer is looking through the viewfinder, can feel somehow like a weapon. So you said in various instances that you don't really shoot from the viewfinder, but rather from the shoulder or from the hip. Is this in relation to the fact that the camera can sometimes feel like a weapon? So do you think about the weight of that weapon when you photograph, basically?
I think of it in two terms. One, my safety and security, because once I do this, now I have drawn attention to myself. And if it's in an environment or a situation where people don't want to be photographed, I now become a target of their paranoia, anger, fear,
Everything.
violence, whatever it may be. But it's also this idea of not wanting to disrupt the moment, and so it's really trying to sort of slither in and out of situations. This is more about street photography, or like, let's say, events, or where you're in the public. It's not like when I'm in your home
Sure.
type of
Course.
thing. But even then, there are times where I might be in a very intimate, physically intimate situation, and I'm shooting from the hip, so to speak, because I don't know. It's partly because the moment of going and doing this, I might miss the actual moment. I know it's very weird. I know I wonder about that. Anyway, but that so it's sort of two. There's two elements to that. To not wanting to draw attention to myself, and not wanting to disrupt the moment. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I just sort of feel, there's something else I've come to realize is how anxious I am when I'm photographing. Even after 45 years, like there's an anxiety because and it's so interesting if you get to do something long enough and live long enough, you kind of like can reflect on like, wow, yeah, I really was an asshole when, no, I'm joking, but but that it's sort of like so often I'm in a state of anxiety when I'm working because I'm either worried about like I'm doing crap work, or I'm worried that I'm going to miss it, or I'm worried about what the people around me think, or sometimes I can be very self-conscious because you become the object of attention, and it can be positive attention, think people think you're cool, but it can also be very negative, but there are all these things like roiling in my head and my heart, at these moments. And 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 there's something about shooting this idea of the abandoned moment of shooting
Mhm.
from the hip, which could be from anywhere, not just the hip, that it almost frees me from that anxiety. You know, no, free. I become free. It frees me from it. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I guess one could also postulate that it also, by not being so precise, I'm allowing for a kind of a serendipity, or mistakes or whatever you want to call it, to happen. Now, having said
Mhm.
all that, if I'm in a situation where it's sort of like, this is such an important moment and it might never happen again and I've got to get it right, I'm looking through the viewfinder, I'm looking at my edges, I am bearing down on that composition in that moment. So there is no one way that I do this, but there's sort of a variety of approaches that are in my toolbox, if you like, that I've developed over the
Yeah.
years.
Who were you when you started the abandoned moment, and who were you when you selected the last picture?
So, well, who was I when I started it? I was a 19-year old photo student in London, in Bath, England, making that picture of the Jamaican preacher holding the Bible. I didn't know what I was doing. I was playing around. I think my hippie friend was playing the harmonica 5 feet away. So that was who I was. I was just a kid discovering this new world. Both the new world of photography and the world. Um, and now, um, I'm super self-conscious and conscious of wanting to look for greatness and impact in the images that I choose.
How do you realize that your project really has an impact? I mean, it's a tough question because, of course, you don't work to necessarily for others, like not for others in terms of like commissions by others, to show others your way, but you also work for yourself, I would imagine. So, when was the first time you realized that your work was having a significant impact on yourself or on others?
So when was the first time, or in general, when do I know? Or
In
both?
general, yes. All right. If
Okay.
you have time for us,
Well, again, the
we're loving
first
this.
time was definitely the work in Northern Ireland, like I had
The
said,
your
where I wasn't only getting feedback from editors who now, like all these European editors, wanted to publish the work, but I was looking at the images going like, yeah, there's finally something there. There's like a depth and a there's something there to the images. So But in general, it's a very no, it's a really great question. It's a really interesting process because, especially at this stage of my life and career, and we recently had an example of this. When I'm working on a personal project, where I'm not getting paid and nobody's expecting it, and we're really just sort of floating out in the universe on our own. uh as I like to say, we jumped off the cliff and there's no safety net. um it's not until I start to share the work, but that could be like a workshop with 8 people, or it could be like an online presentation, where you put yourself out there, you put your work out there, and you can hear and feel the response. And it becomes, basically what we're looking for, I think, or what I'm looking for, is a kind of an affirmation. And I don't mean that like in a pathetic way. Oh, sure, that exists too, but just like it, like that idea of so, for example, just a month or two ago, Julie and I were doing an online presentation, and we showed excerpts of American sketches, and we showed picture. I would put up a picture, and Julie read an excerpt of her text, and it was. I can't describe the experience. It was sort of like beyond affirming. It was like I was so high, like, wow, this is really working. And then you could see the comments coming on, in real time. This is so powerful. This is so moving. And it wasn't just about my work, it was about our work. The symbiosis of the words she was expressing, and while looking at the images. So it's like those moments are what I live for. And then it empowers me to keep on going. Now there's a different kind of empowerment. You you show that work to an editor or a curator, and they are like, yeah, okay, we want to publish it. Well, of course, that's another level and another kind of affirmation, and um a push to keep on going. So it's
Absolutely.
sort of a combination of, it really is. And isn't the thing about this kind of work, like, I could sit with you guys, and I hope one day I can physically sit with you guys and maybe show you something I've done. And if either of you are like, do anything positive, it will stick with me for the rest of my life. And in the other way, if someone is willing to be, you know, um, honest enough and go, yeah, that's not so great. I'm. It's like I'll never like that work. But I'm
Oh,
saying, but I'm saying it can go from the granular, like
yeah,
one
Yeah.
person's opinion, not opinion, reaction to
Reaction.
a mass audience.
Um,
So there's
yeah.
so many multiple levels of like achieving that. I know affirmation's a weird word because there's this sort of there's a psychological, emotional element to it, but it's true. It's true because we're
Absolutely.
not making widgets. I'm not
no,
making something. Nothing against people who make widgets. Thank God they do that,
God forbid. Yeah,
right? Because that's why everything works. But we're
absolutely.
doing we're creating these like subjective pieces of information, and so it's a much more complex
And
feedback loop.
absolutely. And after 40 years, 45 years of experience, is there anything that still surprises you about the craft, about documentary photography, about photojournalism in particular, that you're like, "Ah, damn,
Oh yeah. No, honestly, not every day, but any day I go out with a camera.
yeah,
Yeah, but some kind of light, or some kind of composition, or a character, or a piece of knowledge, or something I witnessed. It's again, that's what I love. That's why this is so goddamn addictive.
hmm it's always new, it's always surprising. Wow,
As long as you can retain that openness, yeah. Now if you become inured, hardened, and you become cynical, well then game over. you
that's
know
over. Fair enough.
yeah, yeah.
It's very, very interesting. Thank you, Ed, truly. you've often said that your photographs are often stronger than your memories, if I'm not mistaken. And I wanted to ask you, what is your relationship today with your images compared to the moments you have experienced, you have lived in a way?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And it's interesting because I've over the last 2 years, I've gone through my complete archive and I've donated
Yeah.
it to the Briscoe Center for American Studies in Austin, Texas. And then we just moved out of our home for a year. And so I've been dismantling my studio of 40 years. So this is very fresh, very fresh, where I've been looking at my work in this other way. And um, so your question was again, what's the difference between the moment
Uh,
I made it and now?
the memories you have,
The memory.
exactly.
Well, sometimes now I will look at an image or a set of images and they will, so it's multifaceted. It can bring me back to that moment, in really powerful ways. And then sometimes the m- the memory is distant, but I put this, like, I look at the image in a new way, because now I'm not looking at it with the eyes of the 30-year-old or the 40-year-old. I'm looking at it through my eyes, of a 67
Yeah.
year old man who has seen so much, and through the prism of what's going on today. So, for instance, I did this 3-year project on Jewish settlers in the West Bank in the mid 1990s. I look at that work today in light of what's happening, and then I'm thinking, no, it still holds up, but it's sort of like, what, it's heartbreaking. Like, what a time capsule of a time that I don't see how it could ever happen again. And it wasn't great even back then. So it's an interesting, or I look at my work on the Kurds, on the Kurdish people, and then there's that sense of, like, through today's eyes, it's like, the Kurds in Iraq are doing great, but I was with them when they were in the mountains, bedraggled. They just come out of a 15-year genocide, under Saddam, so it's about perspective, I guess. So there's
Hmm.
memory and then there's perspective, and I guess this gets into also the subjective and the subconscious, but yeah, it's interesting. That's a really great question. It makes me think
Yeah,
of something totally different, but I don't know
okay,
why.
go
If you'll
ahead.
if you'll if you'll allow me, indulge me.
Absolutely.
Um, I remember years ago, way back, I think in the 1990s or 80s, I went to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. That's where I was living, and they had an exhibition of Ansel Adams prints. Ansel Adams, the
Yes,
great, like, American landscape
absolutely.
photographer, and they showed prints he made in the 1940s, and then the same images that he printed in the 1970s. And it was amazing because the the later prints were dark and muddy and almost like, was the artist, were they losing their vision, or literally, like, and it was just so fascinating that as a young man, in the moment, he printed them crisp, and the zone system, like, perfect
Yeah.
gradations and the grayscale. But then as an older man before he died, they were dark and heavy. And it's again, so it's perspective, right?
Yeah.
Um, I would like to
True.
believe that this is also about, like, our individual evolutions and the arcs of our lives, that hopefully we do not remain the same. That
Yes.
there is a, beyond maturing, there's a kind of a resonance. There's like a weight that we take on, and it's a positive weight, not a negative weight. Well, unless you've had a life full of total
Sure.
trauma and loss.
Sure.
Anyway, so well, like everyone's lives, it's a mixture, right?
Absolutely. That's a
So
perfect
anyways,
example. Yeah, like this that you were saying right now. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. It was absolutely fair and perfect to this question.
I think it's really important, and it's instructive for us to think about it in these terms, that life is not constant, and one hopes that over time you grow and you develop and you evolve, and in whatever direction it goes, and that one's art, one's creative output, whatever you want to call it, also evolves. And I think about that even now with the digital workflow, which I love. I love it. Even though the first 20 years of my life I was in a darkroom, I love it. The digital workflow that you know like recently, talk about influence, like there's some photographers I've been looking at their work, and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting, the look they're getting in their color. And so I'm like playing around with clarity and dehazing, and not in any extreme way. I mean, they would still hold up to world press standards, but this idea of that we don't need to remain constant.
I can absolutely agree. Yes. I would like to move section a little bit.
Absolutely.
And the first question, just settling down. The first question I wanted to ask you, we're doing this limited edition book, which is something very different, if I may say, from what maybe you've been doing so far, as well as with us. And I wanted to start immediately with the very first question, which will be about the title, which evokes, in a way, some sort of music analogy, in a way of visual improvisations or repetitions of certain themes. Could you elaborate a little bit on the title and the vision we have for the project?
Yeah, I think, well, the idea of visual riffs came to me, I want to say maybe 4 years ago, give or take a few months, where
Yeah.
like, so Instagram for me has become, specifically Instagram, but the other social media channels, but Instagram has become this like incredibly powerful and creative tool where I am a publisher and no one can tell me what to do. And so, there was a period, what was it, 2013, 14, where I was playing with like double exposures, until my 14-year-old daughter said to me, Dad, putting together two bad pictures to make a good one isn't a very good idea. And then it's like I dropped that one. It's like, thanks a lot, Isabel. I love the brutality of and
Yeah,
honesty of
me
you.
too. Teenagers are like that.
Yeah. Anyway,
Teenagers do
and
that
so,
to me.
so, but
Yeah.
over the last like whatever 10, 12 years since Instagram came about, it's become this wonderful form of self-expression. And not just self-expression, but also like communication. Like I deal with real hard issues, so anyway, so the way I've been using Instagram, you know, it could be from, like there was an article last week in the Guardian newspaper about California farm workers. I photographed California farm workers over the years. So, we're going to put together a post that's
Yeah.
based on the reporting, but then that allows me to use images to hopefully bring that to life. So the idea of visual riffs came about 4 years ago, where I thought, I've got this vast archive and I'm very organized, so it's very easy for me to sort of dive into that well and
Yeah.
and harvest, or that garden, and harvest things. And I thought, well, visual riffs. Honestly, I don't remember. Like these things just happen for me, and then I thought, oh, I love that idea. So we'll look for themes, and it started like like really simple, whatever, legs, arms. I don't know, like just the most simple terms, pain, love, and then over time it's evolved into sayings or colloquialisms or terms, and so that's really how it evolved. And then we would go in to the archive and then look for, images that would sort of fulfill that with a minimal amount of writing, but words are absolutely important. And and again, I've got images of over a 45-year period. So and again, I go to this quote by Don McCullen of where he would, I can't remember if I've said this to you guys, and I'm sorry if not, if I have, I'm repeating myself, but that I remember as some lecture of his way back, and he was saying about how he'd be lying in his bed, and in the other room he would hear his negatives talking to each other. So that was the inspiration in a way for Well, in general, like my last four books have been out of my archive, is this idea of that the archive is a living thing, especially if it's organized and it's accessible. And so, because I'm a I'm a I'm an essayist. I'm not a poet, right? I work on the Kurds, on heat stress, on the Protestants in the Northern Ireland, Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Very contained,
Yeah,
specific, whether they're very big themes or very
course, of
specific
course.
themes, and so the idea that I can now find a picture from the Kurdish work that connects with pictures from whatever, Northern Ireland or India, is to me really exciting. And so that's really the idea behind it. Yeah, that's really the idea behind it. And it's also feels like this is sort of ap- appropriate, for lack of a better term, at this sort of stage in my life and my career, where I'm continuing to make. That's the other thing. Like some of these riffs, I might have a picture I made a month ago
Yes.
with a picture I made 40 years ago, or whatever. That idea.
Okay, just another question. So, visual riff, visual riffs, like a novel, has chapters. Well, I know that an author generally doesn't play favorites with with their own creation, but is there a chapter, a planned chapter that resonates with you more than others?
No, I think one of the chapter that really resonated for me was this sort of conflict and testimony. Because in a way that's in some ways, the most highly charged and emotional and challenging kinds of imagery. And they continue to be the kinds of images that, yeah, that I just feel have such importance. And maybe also the harder images to make, to capture. But yeah, I will also say the chapter Unseen was really cool to work on. Like that was
Good.
like revelatory. Again, I know I've said this before, but again, I don't know if I said it to you, but it's like I talk about this when I teach. Again, is like what's so interesting is that all my work is visual, and yet it emanates from words. When I learned the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without a nation of their own, boom, I was in.
Yeah.
It isn't because I had gone to Kurdistan. It was like, oh my God, what a fact. I want to explore that. So
Absolutely.
so much of my work, all of my work emanates from words.
Love that.
Thank
And
you.
I think this summarizes perfectly. As I was saying before, Marcos made a selection of a bunch of images that we would like to discuss together. This would be the first one, actually. So whenever you're ready, we can start.
So this is interesting because this is not an image that I've normally chosen from this scene, which is in Baluchistan. It's like at a camel festival, and Baluchistan is a huge province of Pakistan.
Okay.
And this is a really cool image, though. See, this
Yeah.
is so interesting how you look at your work with a different eye, and you find gems, you find things you didn't see. But so yeah, this was a kind of a really bizarre moment because actually, so this is in 1998, I want to say, and that actually is a man on the right. It's or a I guess we would call him a transgender man now.
Yeah.
But anyway, and what was interesting and was almost a little frightening for me was the
Yes.
intensity of the guy on the left, who's I think a tribal guy. He's um, that there was a kind of
Yeah.
a sexual intensity that was, I felt actually scared for the person on the right. That
Mm.
I think he or she felt that way. Again, I'm not sure how they would represent themselves because there's a thousands of years tradition in South Asia of men either
Hijra.
dressing as women or yeah, hijra, exactly. So it's part
Exactly.
of a great long tradition. But anyway, that was my takeaway from this scene, was just the kind of intensity of him grabbing her and almost feeling a little fearful for her.
Yeah, there is this contrast between the two phases, two completely different emotional states for sure. And the hijra, I didn't know in Pakistan they were still. I know for sure in India they're a pretty big topic of conversation as well. And it's interesting to hear that also in Pakistan already at the time it was something that was already visible. I've done a minor in religious studies when I was in the Netherlands, so I know a little bit of religion myself.
Oh,
So
cool. So wait, you lived in the Netherlands.
I did.
Okay.
I
Right.
left.
Sorry.
Yes, that's something for later. I'll tell you later.
Exactly. Right.
The
Stay on
second
point,
one,
Ed. Stay on point.
exactly. It's hard with these talks, right? I feel like in the conversation we're having, we're drifting so much, but
Well, you
it's
got
interesting.
great. So
Thank you. The second one would be, yes,
Oh yeah.
this
yeah,
one.
yeah. So this, for me, is one of the most important images I've ever made, actually. And this was in southeastern Turkey, in the city of Diyarbakir. And this was when I was working on my first major project with National Geographic magazine, a story that I proposed to them, looking at the plight of the Kurds, the Kurdish people.
Yeah.
And I went to 8 different countries, but in this scene, and actually, I don't know if we have time to. The backstory of this, though, is that
Yeah.
3 days earlier, I was in Van, Turkey, which is way out in eastern Turkey, and I had one of the literally, I'll never forget this. I was like in a phone booth in the middle of nowhere, calling my editor back in DC, and she was basically expressing frustration with my work at that point. My first story for them, right? And I'm like
Okay.
watching my life crumble, or I'm, and so she said, "Just go back to Diyarbakir and work on
Take
something else."
pictures.
And so I went back to the Diyarbakir, which is sort of the capital of that region, and I decided to spend a few days with a Kurdish human rights lawyer. So it's
Wow.
again because of this pivot and, in a sense, a kind of very harsh feedback from an editor. It enabled me to then be in position to make this image. And then so this young Kurdish woman was suspected of being a member of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which the
Oh,
Turkish government has been at war with since the early '80s, I want to say. And anyway, and so when the magazine came out, I think it was May of 1992, and this image was published. The Turkish government confiscated all the issues of that edition, and then banned media from these quote unquote terrorist courts.
whoa. Damn. Wow. I have no words. I've always wanted to hear the story behind it. I've read
Absolutely.
it because I've been stalking you in that sense. But I've always wanted to hear from you, and it's so touchful. Like, honestly. Wow. Thank
And
you.
also the pride and strength in her,
That she
where she's
has.
just
Yeah.
putting her the chin out with, yeah, just like
Yeah,
there's something so powerful about that. It's like
Mm.
defiant.
exactly.
Yeah.
Totally defiant. Absolutely. The next one would be this one.
Hmm. Yeah. So, um, right. It seems like the American soldier seems a bit confused about what he's doing, but this is in 1991, after the first Gulf War. And
Yeah.
actually, this was a case where American and European forces were doing something really good. They were using their ability and their power to create a protection zone for the Kurdish people in northern Iraq. And I assume this is part of the kind of hearts and minds thing, where I don't know why they were these so American soldiers were driving with Barbie dolls, but anyway,
Hmm.
so he's sort of giving this young Kurdish girl a Barbie doll. But it's interesting because she obviously is joyful that, for first of all,
Yeah.
she's safe after years of not being safe, and also getting something that clearly was very made her happy. But the soldier just seems so confused and
Yeah.
conflicted. That's what I read in this picture.
Absolutely beautiful. I think, and there's this light exactly there hitting exactly where it needs to hit. So
Yeah.
And it's
amazing.
so up
Well, that's a
close.
strobe light.
Yes, exactly.
Ooh.
Wow,
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Next one is.
Oh, we love this one.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Ed.
Yeah, so this was in a place you would not expect. This was like in Sonoma County in California. You would not expect this kind of thing happening, but the KKK was holding a rally. This was in the late '80s when they were starting to sort of, raise their heads a bit, and have these public events. And there was something that I learned. I was covering this for Time magazine, and what I learned there was how I can unwittingly become a propagandist for a side that I would ordinarily abhor and not support. Because at one point, a few of the KKK guys came out, and then the protesters started throwing like rocks at them and hitting them, and I was trying to make pictures of that, but then I realized it's like if this picture goes out, it might actually engender empathy for the
The opposite
KKK.
side.
And now, you talked about objectivity and earlier, and I said I'm objective in these scenes, but I'm sorry, there are just certain issues where there is, for me, there's only one side, and
Absolutely.
Totally
there's only
agree.
one way of looking at it. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Next one. We know this one, of course. But please illuminate
Yeah,
us.
so this is in Cairo, and this was from a story I did on the City of the Dead, this vast, very ancient and very important cemetery in Muslim culture. Important Sufi saints and clerics are buried there, as well as prominent Egyptian families. And we went there to do a story about overpopulation, how hundreds of thousands of people were living in this cemetery, but it also is still an active cemetery. So this was a funeral procession entering this is called the City of the Dead, or that's what we say in English.
The
And
necropolis.
yeah, exactly. And I was just in Cairo last year a few times to display this work, and it was amazing because the 17-year-old young man Medhat that we had hired back in 1993 as our quote unquote fixer, because he lived in that area, he's now in his late 50s. He found me through Facebook, and we were able to meet up. It was amazing, like a circle of life moment. And then I was actually able to introduce him to the current American ambassador to Egypt, and she went and for Eid into the City of the Dead and joined him. Anyway, it's just one of these beautiful moments of kind of a circle of life, yeah, yeah.
Wow, I guess that truly wraps it up, everything so far. So, and honestly, thank you for being so truthful with us, so open and so empathetic in a way, So thank you, thank you, thank you for
You're
everything.
welcome.
And it's been honestly, and I think Marilu feels the same way, a wonderful, wonderful interview. So, wow. We hope
Well,
we
you
made
guys
you
are
feel
awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
We try.
it was an amazing conversation because it really, really felt like a conversation, and even more so than a proper interview. Yeah, it was a very familiar tone that I personally very, very much appreciated. There was a closeness of some kind that I felt during this conversation. And I would like to wrap it up with a message for our viewers. So if you enjoyed this talk as much as we did while doing it, keep supporting us, keep following us, and don't miss out on Visual Riff. Thank you, Ed, for being with us. Thank you. It was an amazing ride.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Ciao.
Okay.
Speak to you soon.